November 9th, 1939. The car crept toward Café Backus, just meters from the German border in the Dutch town of Venlo. MI6 operative Captain Sigismund Payne Best felt a stinging sense of doom. Something was wrong. Ahead, Dr. Franz Fischer stood waiting. Best didn't trust him, nor did he trust his promise of bringing down Hitler from within. After questioning him for hours, he was certain Fischer was a Nazi spy. But Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain didn't listen. He was sure this was a golden opportunity to put an end to the war before it truly began. Now, here he was, along with his partner, Major Richard Stevens, practically inside Germany. The usual border barriers were missing. Odd. Best slid a hand into his coat, feeling the grip of his Browning pistol. Smiling, Fischer gestured toward the cafe, where a high-ranking German general, the alleged leader of the coup attempt, awaited. Best stepped out of the car. A deafening screech of tires tore the air. An open-topped military vehicle roared in from the German side, packed with soldiers. Gunfire erupted as the German truck blocked the British car. The MI6 spies scrambled, pistols barking in response, but they were outgunned, outnumbered. The trap had been sprung. The day would be remembered as both one of the greatest German intelligence victories and one of Hitler's biggest blunders of the war. The fate of Best and Stevens was decided the previous evening. 300 miles away in Munich, Hitler was giving a speech at the Bürgerbräukeller Beer Hall in commemoration of the 1923 failed coup attempt he had led 16 years earlier. This event was pivotal in Nazi propaganda, and the Führer usually spoke fervently for over 2 hours. For a man named Georg Elser, this was crucial as he planned to eliminate Hitler that very day. The beer hall was packed. Smoke hung in the air, voices rising and falling in conversation. At the front, Adolf Hitler addressed the crowd. Inches from the Führer, hidden inside a pillar near the speaker's podium, Elser's bomb waited. He had worked for months, hollowing out the stone night after night, installing the explosives and setting a timer for 9:20 p.m. He was a skilled watchmaker, and now he had followed all of his experience and loathing for the Nazi regime into a single device. As he fled from Germany on a train, he checked his watch. Everything was in place. Inside the beer hall, Hitler spoke. The crowd listened. Elser's watch read 9:05 p.m. 15 more minutes. Suddenly, Hitler finished. He gathered his notes, glanced at his aides, and left the podium as if he suspected something. This was unprecedented. As he tried to escape the consequences of what he believed was the assassination of Hitler, Elser had no idea his plan had been foiled. 9:07 p.m. The crowd stirred. Chairs scraped. Hitler, surrounded by his men, moved toward the exit. 13 minutes later, with several people still gathered at the beer hall, a thunderous explosion ripped through the hall. Windows shattered. Smoke filled the air. Debris rained down. The podium was reduced to dust. As Nazi authorities were still trying to grasp what had just happened, Elser reached the German border with Switzerland. He was unable to justify his attempt to cross the border. It was wartime, and leaving Germany was not as simple as it had been before. As he was being detained for further questioning, the news of the assassination attempt reached every German military radio in the Reich. Elser was searched thoroughly, and a postcard of the Bürgerbräukeller, detonator parts, hand-drawn sketches of explosive mechanisms, a pair of pliers, and other tools were found in his possession. From the very beginning, Elser admitted to working completely alone, but due to the sophistication of the bomb mechanism and Elser's ill-prepared escape attempt, German officials were sure he must be part of a larger team. Hitler was furious. He saw conspiracies everywhere. There had to be a greater plot. He wasn't just sure there were others, he was certain they were British operatives. He would make an example of them. He called the Sicherheitsdienst, the SS's own intelligence service. Some of its men had made contact with British operatives, and they had gained their trust. It was time to make them pay in blood. The order was absurd. A lawyer-turned-intelligence officer, Major Walter Schellenberg, and his team at the Sicherheitsdienst had spent months deceiving British MI6 agents working their way in. Now, they stood on the brink of infiltrating the entire organization. If they played their cards right, they would gain direct access to top-secret British intelligence for the rest of the war. But now, Hitler wanted them to throw it all away. His impulsive command was to capture their British contacts immediately, all because of a hunch that the MI6 had orchestrated the latest assassination attempt against him. The Sicherheitsdienst operatives weren't just adversaries of MI6, they respected it, even revered it. It was widely known that Reinhard Heydrich, the ruthless head of the SD, admired MI6 to the point of imitation, signing his letters with a simple C in green ink, just as MI6 chiefs had done for decades. For the SD, infiltrating the MI6 was the ultimate triumph in the world of espionage. For months, the Sicherheitsdienst had identified the Netherlands as the key to breaking into MI6. As the only neutral country between Germany and the Allied powers, it had become a battleground for spies on both sides, a chaotic, information-rich gateway into the otherwise impenetrable British intelligence service. Yet, by the outbreak of war, the MI6 was not what it once was. Its chief, Admiral Hugh Sinclair, was losing the battle against cancer, and his deputy, Colonel Claude Marjoribanks Dancy, was already maneuvering for control. Dancy had built his own parallel spy network, Z Organization, an independent web of intelligence assets disguised as businessmen and journalists operating across Europe. His goal was to ensure that if MI6's official networks, which operated under British Passport Control Offices, or PCOs, were compromised during wartime, Z Organization could take over. One of Dancy's most trusted operatives was Captain Sigismund Payne Best, a veteran intelligence officer who had run espionage operations in Holland since World War I. Having settled in the Netherlands after the war, he used the cover of a pharmaceutical import-export business to smuggle agents in and out of Germany. Best was no amateur. He was seasoned, cautious, and unlikely to fall for Schellenberg's deception. But in August 1939, on the eve of war, Dancy merged Z Organization with MI6's existing PCO network. Some suspected he did this to consolidate his power and improve his chances of succeeding Sinclair as MI6 chief. But the decision proved disastrous. Unbeknownst to Dancy, MI6's network in the Netherlands was already heavily infiltrated by German intelligence. The station chief at the British Embassy in The Hague, Major Richard Stevens, was entirely out of his depth. Lacking real espionage experience, he failed to recognize that at least 2 of his own agents were double agents working for the Germans. The SD's penetration of MI6 was so extensive that they had even positioned a surveillance camera on a canal barge directly opposite Stevens' office. From there, they could monitor every move and read British intelligence reports like an open book. As war erupted in September 1939, Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, having failed miserably to appease Hitler and prevent the conflict, was still looking for an immediate way out of the carnage. Reports emerged that a group of senior German army officers were plotting to overthrow Hitler and had reached out to the British embassy in The Hague for help. Chamberlain, desperate to avoid a prolonged war, saw the potential in this alleged coup. He had no idea this was Schellenberg's trap. Schellenberg used Dr. Franz Fischer, a supposed German informant and one of the men who had already infiltrated the MI6 operations in the Netherlands. Fischer promised that high-ranking Wehrmacht officers intended to oust Hitler and install a military junta, which would then negotiate peace with Britain. Best was deeply skeptical. He interrogated Fischer for hours and concluded that he was likely an SD agent trying to lure them into a trap. He warned Dancy and Chamberlain, recommending that Fischer be brought to London and imprisoned for the remainder of the war. He was ignored. Pressured by Chamberlain and MI6's leadership, Best and Stevens pressed forward with meetings to secure contact with the alleged coup's top conspirators. But the Germans, feeling they were in, demanded an official British declaration of war aims and objectives. The idea was that the German junta that would take over needed to know the terms of a possible peace arrangement. When the draft statement reached the British cabinet, the reaction was explosive. Outrage filled the room. The document was not just rejected, it was condemned. Winston Churchill, furious, led the charge against the clandestine talks. British Undersecretary for Foreign Affairs Alexander Cadogan went even further, scrawling a chilling suspicion in his diary. He believed the coup plotters were Nazi agents. Then, in October 1939, the game grew even more dangerous. Fischer introduced them to a supposed Luftwaffe officer, Major Solms. He was an SD intelligence officer, Johannes Travaglio. The trap tightened. The British operatives, still believing they had the upper hand, were ordered to prove their legitimacy by arranging for a coded message to be broadcast on the BBC's German language program. The request shot up the chain of command, reaching the highest echelons of Whitehall. Against all odds and against Best's own misgivings, the broadcast was approved. The moment the signal went live, MI6 had sealed its fate. In Berlin, Reinhard Heydrich listened. The British had taken the bait. The SD escalated their scheme. Walter Schellenberg took over as the lead in what was now becoming a full-fledged entrapment operation. He posed as Major Schemmel, a fictitious high-ranking officer within the supposed anti-Nazi resistance movement. With each new meeting, Best and Stevens were fed more lies, and with each new lie, they were drawn deeper into the SD's web. The SD's plan was to completely infiltrate MI6 and work their way deeper and deeper until they could either guarantee total access for the rest of the war, or, if discovered, the damage be so great that the agency would be permanently crippled and forced to dissolve. Then, on November 9th, 1939, came the orders from Hitler. Instead of continuing with the deception, Schellenberg and Fischer were to capture their British contacts and bring them to Germany, to be made an example after Elser's assassination attempt. The SD team believed this was a massive blunder. They were willingly giving away the greatest German intelligence victory of the war over one of Hitler's whims. But there was no questioning the Führer. They would have to kidnap the British agents. The two British spies, accompanied by Dutch intelligence officer Lieutenant Dirk Klopp, arrived at Café Backus, a meeting point just meters from the German border. They had used this location before. As the Germans claimed, this ensured their safety. They had begun to grow suspicious, sensing that they were being played. Armed with Browning pistols, they approached the cafe, hoping they would finally be able to meet with the German general who was allegedly leading the coup. Instead, they walked straight into an ambush. An open-topped German vehicle, loaded with armed men, roared across the border. Shots rang out. Best and Stevens, caught off guard, hesitated for a fraction of a second, just long enough for the SD agents to surround them. Klopp tried to fight back, drawing his weapon, but he was gunned down on the spot. The British spies were seized, forced into a car, and driven across the border into Nazi Germany. The gate behind them slammed shut. The repercussions were immediate. The Venlo incident, as it came to be known, gave Hitler a pretext to justify his invasion of the Netherlands in May 1940. He had proof that the Netherlands was neutral only in words. The British government, humiliated, realized too late that they had been utterly deceived. The debacle eroded faith in MI6, leading new Prime Minister Winston Churchill to sideline the agency and create a new covert operations unit. The Special Operations Executive, or SOE, which would go on to play a pivotal role in resistance movements across occupied Europe. Best and Stevens, now prisoners of the Gestapo, were subjected to relentless interrogation. While Best claimed in his later memoirs that he revealed nothing of value, Stevens is believed to have cracked under pressure. Their capture also meant that sensitive MI6 operations across Europe had been compromised. British intelligence, reeling from the disaster, pulled its operatives from the Netherlands and sealed records of the incident for 100 years. Meanwhile, Germany used the incident for propaganda, linking Best and Stevens to Elsa's failed assassination attempt. Elsa was sent to Dachau. He spent years in captivity, a prisoner kept alive as a curiosity. Then, in April 1945, with the war all but lost, Hitler ordered his execution. Best and Stevens were spared, kept alive as bargaining chips for a potential post-war show trial. As Germany crumbled in 1945, the two spies were liberated by Allied forces. Emaciated but alive, they returned to Britain, where Best capitalized on his experience by publishing a bestseller while Stevens faded into obscurity. The Venlo incident was a disaster that reshaped British intelligence. It highlighted the dangers of wishful thinking in espionage and the perils of underestimating the enemy. But it could also have been much worse. Had Hitler left the SD to continue their infiltration, Germany would have had an unprecedented advantage that could have turned the tide of World War II.